2022, what a year it was, and for me it featured all of the highs and the lows of my climbing journey so far. It was also a year with some great firsts for me. My first time outdoor bouldering, my first time visiting the Peak District, and my first time on-siting a 70 plus route. But amongst all of that, there was also some not so great firsts as well. My first time having to drop out of a competition, and my first climbing related injury. After a great start to my year, I reached a plateau in my climbing. This is because I was growing at the time, which meant that I was experiencing quite a severe loss in balance and spatial awareness. Regardless of this, I wasn't happy with my reduced rate of improvement, so I increased the intensity and quantity of my training and reduced the amount of rest in between sessions. After deciding to up my workload, a week of my training looked something like this. My progression sped up again, and I began climbing better than I ever had before. But something else was also happening. Something I had been warned to avoid since I started climbing back in May 2021. Little did I know at the time, but my growing joints just couldn't keep up with the increased workload. The amount of rest I'd given myself between sessions just wasn't enough for me to recover. A few weeks of me following the new training schedule pass, and everything was going really well. Until it isn't. It's the 19th of February. After a session in here, I then headed to a climbing centre where I attempted my then project, which was a 7C or V9 boulder, and I managed to top it. But then I went on to try a finger strength session, and then it happened. Exactly what I'd been told to avoid when I started climbing in May the year before. I had a growth plate fracture. At this point, I had to stop climbing, and I couldn't use my left hand at all. I began following the expert advice of Simon at Vice Physiotherapy in Bristol. Simon is a specialist in my injury, and he was able to correctly diagnose it through the phone without ever having seen my finger, about 2 weeks before the NHS managed to. The thing is, my injury didn't show up the first time my finger was x-rayed. In fact, it wasn't until 2 weeks after Simon had correctly identified my injury that the fracture even showed up on an x-ray. I can quite clearly remember the feeling I felt when I realised that what was ahead of me was more time recovering than I'd had since I started lead climbing. And I realised I had months ahead of me where I couldn't use my left hand at all. At the time, I was in the climbing squad, but obviously I couldn't climb anymore, so one of my coaches helped me to write an off-the-wall training plan, which I would follow during the squad sessions and throughout the rest of the week. This new plan was tailored to target my core, legs and general flexibility, as these were areas I hadn't worked on as much before. Especially my legs, as I've never done anything more than run a 3k fun run once a year where I used to live. This continued for a few weeks, around 3 or 4 weeks as far as I can tell by my training diary here. But, although the coaches were incredibly supportive, in the end I decided to leave my squad. This continued all the way until the point when I could begin to use my fingers again. Obviously, I began climbing first of all on vertical walls with large holds, but following Simon's advice, I quickly increased my climbing to 3 times a week, but I stayed below kind of V4 and nothing harder than 6C routes. It took me longer than I had off to get back to where I was before the injury, but before too long I was back to being able to climb every other day, and I was able to try hard again. In the summer months I was climbing outdoors every week, which is something I found out that I really love to do. I was able to project boulders that were around 7C to 7C plus, font grade or V9 to V10, and I was able to try routes that were, again, some in the ranges between 7A to 7C. I realised I never really had enough confidence to try any routes that were harder than that, because I've always been a little bit more nervous with route climbing outdoors. Throughout the summer, I would have occasional twinges in my finger, where it would swell a little bit more than usual, or be a little bit more painful than usual. but I was never really very worried about these because they would always die away pretty quickly. Apart from one time, which was the worst of these, and it happened in July, and I was kind of concerned about it, and I wanted it to be checked up on by a medical professional. So I went to hospital, and they didn't agree to scan it. Their reasoning was that it would just be soft tissue irritation, and that the pain was just in my head. So they sent me off with nothing but the message to take it easy for a couple of weeks. I did that and the pain died away. So, going very cautiously, I upped my climbing again to every other day. Now this brings us to August. I visited Raven Tour in the Peak District, and I tried out for the Lattice Elite Squad. It was a very successful weekend. I got a few moves on a boulder I was trying in Raven Tour, named Ben's Roof for 70+, and the tryout went well, so my training with Lattice began. Now I move on into my competition season, which kicked off with a bouldering comp. I came fourth, but I didn't really mind, because I also managed to climb Quartzite's amazing life-size replica of the Rhino boulder from Rocklands in South Africa, or as they're calling their replica, the Gym Rhino, which will be going on a tour of Europe and the UK this year. For more information, make sure to check out their website. The link will be on the screen and in the description below. Then I move on to my next competition. This one is a lead comp, and I come second, which I was happy about, and I also managed to get my first 70+ on site, which I was very happy about. At this point, everything was going really well, until it wasn't. About a week before my next competition was scheduled, I began getting more pain in my finger once again, and it swelled larger than ever before. Naturally, I was worried, so I went to a hospital to get it checked up on. This time they agreed to scan it, but when they did, it confirmed what I feared more than anything else. The X-ray showed that my finger was still fractured, just as it was in February. Now I wondered whether it wasn't still fractured and whether it refractured, but the medical staff at the hospital were certain that it was not a refracture and that it was a non-union. I was then referred to a hand specialist from a different NHS health board. He arranged a CT scan so he could get a detailed look at exactly what was going wrong with my finger, but the result wasn't what I was expecting. In the meantime, I began doing some one-handed climbing and no-handed climbing on vertical walls and slabs, as well as focusing more on my legs and my flexibility. I also want to say a massive thanks to my coaches at Lattice for adapting so quickly to the new circumstances and adjusting my plan to fit my needs. When the CT scan results finally came back, I was informed there was no further action required. Now obviously I was really quite confused by this, as I couldn't see how on earth my finger could go from being broken to being okay in less than a month, when that hadn't happened in all the time since the 19th of February. But it turns out my finger wasn't completely fine. You see, my growth plates have fused, and that means that the injury in my finger has gone from being a growth plate fracture to being a bone fracture. So it's now just a little piece of bone that isn't in the right place. It's been chipped off, and I've been told that they don't think they can do anything with it, because if they did anything to that little piece of bone, it would likely either shatter, or they would end up making more damage than it would actually solve. So they've decided to leave it as it is. And this is from the opinion of the UK leading hand specialist in my injury. He's a man named Tim Horsey, who the hand specialist I had been referred to had been consulting with about my injury, and they both agreed that there wasn't anything that could be safely done at this point. So, what does this mean for me and my climbing? It means I can do this. And this. And this. Obviously not at first. No, of course not. I began climbing on holds that were big holds, and climbing pretty easy stuff. Because I knew that I'd had 5 or 6 weeks off, that meant I knew that I'd need more than that amount of time to be able to get back to where I was in October before stopping. So this is pretty much where I am now. I've been climbing since about the beginning of December, and everything's going well-ish. I'm finding that my finger is a little bit more swollen and hurts a little bit more than it did back in October. But I have a follow-up CT scan in a few weeks, so hopefully that will be able to figure out exactly what's going wrong there. This video has taken me months to create. I've been trying to make it since about September, so yeah, like in different stages. Obviously at this point I've turned it into more like a my 2022 experience, whereas at first it was just like what was going on with my finger. But I'd made a video in November where I was climbing one-handed on a slab, and I'd said at the time that I was going to make a video or post or something soon to explain why that was happening. Obviously 2 months later isn't exactly soon. But anyway, here's the video, and this is my 2022 experience. Thank you to everyone who gave me words of support and encouragement last year. There have been points when I wonder whether climbing is worth the constant discomfort I feel from my injury. But climbing is what I've focused on since May 2021, when I started after the pandemic happened. And every time I ever think about quitting climbing, I just feel like I want to climb. So at least for now, that's what I'm going to continue to do.
Last year was a year of firsts. Some good, some bad, but inevitably, all of it adds up to form the second year of my climbing journey. I hope everyone had a great new year, and I look forward to seeing what lies in wait for me this year, 2023.
Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you soon.